I don't know when the last moment of CSGO is going to be, okay? I don't know if it all ends now. I really don't know. So I'm going to squeeze this video out. Mount Rushmore of CSGO. I've always wanted to do this one. There's no other time to do it. So let's go ahead and talk this through. Listen, I'm Canadian. Hey, we don't have Mount Rushmore, but in Keystone, North, South Dakota, wherever the hell it is, I'm closer to Mount Rushmore than Florida is. All right? So if you're in Florida, I'm more American than you for this next 10 minutes. I'm just kidding. But all right, so what is Mount Rushmore? I had to Google it because I've always heard about it, but essentially it's 4 presidents to represent the nation for different things. For George Washington, the birth of the nation. For Thomas Jefferson, the growth of the nation. For Theodore Reservoir Dog. For their presidents. So I didn't mean to. I'm sure he did some bad stuff. All right. Theodore Roosevelt to represent the development of the United States, and Abraham Lincoln, which probably didn't sound like that. Abraham Lincoln represented the preservation of the United States, okay? So we're not here to get political. I don't know the first thing. Well, I know the first thing, but I don't know really the second or third thing about these guys. But this is just about sort of the idea. When I first thought of it, it was like Mount Rushmore. Well, I know it's not anything recent. So in making some historical content, let's go back a bit and talk about some of the biggest figures for one reason or another, right? But it's literally how impactful they are, for how famous they are, and what they've done in the scene, and what they've done for Counter-Strike in one way or another that will put them up on the Mount Rushmore of CSGO. Okay, so why don't we start with who would be George Washington, the first president of the United States, the first inductee to the Mount Rushmore. It's Get Right. The one exception on this list for me, because all the other ones are going to be leaders of some sort. For Get Right, he was the star of the show, the face of the game in 2013. Him and Doja were the 2 guys who were lurkers, who were stars in their role. It was not until he sort of fell off a bit that other roles started to open up. People realized that if they checked behind him on a flank, every once in a while they would find Get Right. But the real magic of Get Right as a game player was the fact that he could pull off 200 lurks in a row and kill you 180 times. He somehow made magic happen in 1vx situations, not just on flanks. All the clutches that he pulled off. It was non-stop with Get Right as a lurker, as a star player, as a massive player, and he did get the back-to-back #1 in the world ranking. Some people say Flusha was robbed in 2014. I'm with that, obviously. I'm with that movement. Get Right got his major there. The stats didn't favor Get Right, but still, think about that year. Think about 2013 as a whole. And back then, the reason that he's the exception to the leaders is because, first of all, there wasn't a leader that was more influential than Get Right was as a player in 2013. The stature of player that he was, the dominance with the 87-0 win streak that Nip had, and then also the fact that no one even really knew who the IGL was on NIP at the time. Like, of course, it was exist, but nobody really even thought about it. They were just like the best team, but the game was so raw back then, right? As a casual onlooker, you would just see Get Right destroying and saying, well, that's the reason that they're able to win. The truth is it's because they had everything working very well. Get Right was the face of the game. You know, back in 2013, they had McNip burgers in Sweden, and they had the sesame seeds on the bun of the Big Mac. They called it a Big Nip. They were massive, and they were all stars. They were all stars. Best player on the best team, #1 player in the world in the first big year of Counter-Strike. Massive success, really birthed the game in that sense. Someone who really wore his heart on his sleeve, has this, famous photo that everyone's tried to recreate ever since then of him like playing alone in a room on the PCs hours before a game started. And that was something that was always true with Get Right, is that he's a bleeding heart. All he wanted to do was win. He showed it, he proved it so often. And if there's anything that we can credit to his personality, it's his work ethic. When it came to trying, he definitely put in the work. So probably the most famous name at that beginning in CSGO. All right, so next up, Thomas Jefferson, the 3rd president of the United States, was credited for the growth of the United States. So if we talk about players who represented the growth of the game, the first bit of massive growth for me outside of Sweden, there was no star quite like Fallen out of Brazil in terms of growth of the game, considering the size of the region and considering the fact that him winning his 2 majors, being the IGL, and then inspiring the nation of Brazil, and him being looked at as the godfather, his impact and influence is so massive that even today, even if you weren't there, you know how popular Fallen is. You know how many people credit their careers to growing up watching Fallen play, getting inspired. He has an aura of brilliance and mystique and also humility, and somehow wrapped this all up and still was able to accomplish so much as an individual. Definitely one of the greatest IGLs in the history of the game, right up there with Glaive and Kerrigan. In terms of the amount of influence, it's undeniable. You know, maybe the most influential player of all, if you want to just consider the sheer amount of people that know this man's name, because Brazil is so massive. And when it comes to him as a player, well, he absolutely invented the game in a lot of ways as well. He doesn't get enough credit for this, but his Brazilian team that came through, when they played the game and all the Brazilian teams that followed, the Brazilian style was one of aggressive CT reaggressions, taking back space immediately on CT side after you had lost it, when before it was a team would take over a piece of space. Then the CTs would sit back and wait and then deal with the push as passive on the site. When Fallen was playing, that wasn't the case. You take long A on an overpass versus Fallen, he would take it right back if you didn't think you were going to use it. When it came to maps like Train, for example, I've always said on broadcast, Fallen's invented Train. The modern way that people played Train up until it was removed from the game, all the spots that were played were the SK Luminosity spots, and it's the deep angles that he used to use as an opper that everyone copied. He got so much out of his op because he would take such deep lines, way more committed than anybody else was willing to do with an op. You know, when JW would do it, for example, he would bounce out into an angle and like take aggressive pick and fall back, so the aggression was there. But the way Fallen did it was inconspicuously. He wasn't there to make noise, run through a Molotov and swing out and then start scoping. He would stay scoped, move into an angle, go deeper and deeper until the point that if there another guy came out to clear the angle, he'd be a free kill, but he was always willing to take that risk. So he had a very special presence in that way, and he was also an op IGL, which a lot of people didn't think you could be a successful op IGL until Fallen did it. So Fallen as a player, I remember when I was at E-League Atlanta 2017 doing interviews, and I asked everybody who they believed was the best player in the world. So many players said Fallen at that point. It was all these top players. I remember asking them. Taz said Fallen, Device said Fallen, Flusha said Fallen, and that's just because of the special way that he played, actually, that really changed the game. So I think he had massive impact on the meta of maps, on the meta of Counter-Strike as a whole, which very few people can say that. And then also as an individual, as a leader and as a spokesperson for Counter-Strike in Brazil, I don't know anyone really compares to Fallen in that regard. So in terms of growth, they're going to give him growth. Okay, Fallen, the third president of the United States. Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th president of the United States of America. Yeehaw! Theodore Roosevelt, it represents development of the United States. This will be the most late-stage addition to this list in terms of newest players. For me, this is Glaive. Glaive as the IGL to take over from Kerrigan's TSM, turning Astralis into the most winning lineup in history. I've already talked about this so much. You know what he's accomplished, everything. Unlike with Kerrigan, Glaive has defended the longest era in CSGO. And in terms of developing the meta, well, he's done so much. European Counter-Strike used to be the superlative used to describe how good the region was at CS. But after Glaive's Astralis, it was Astralis Counter-Strike that everyone was trying to play. That's all people would talk about. How do we play more like Astralis? What can Astralis teach us? Astralis strats, Astralis setups. There are still so many places where you call Astralis setups on maps. I said before that Flusha was the best throwing HEs, but Astralis took this thing that Flusha knew a long time ago and made it something that all teams did. They showed how valuable that $300 piece of utility was. Astralis were responsible for developing the game to the point that every little bit that was left started to have a 3, 4, 5% impact on the outcome of each map. And they dominated to the point that I just remember at one point watching Astralis win saying, that's it. They can never be beaten. They're just the best. They've taken up too much of the game. They've beaten every land streak. The dominance is there. The eye test, the utility usage, the players that like the teamwork. It's just insane. There were so many things that made them the best, and that's why they were so dominant. And that's why there's all these things about them that I think left so much impact on the game. And so that's why I would say Glaive is responsible for a lot of the development in Counter-Strike and the reason that the Astralis era became an era was because of the move from Kerrigan to Glade. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to stop there and not mention Kerrigan, okay? Because we've got the final president, 16th president of the United States, and the 4th inductee to the Mount Rushmore of CSGO, and that's it, Big Abraham Lincoln. And he is the one who is representing the preservation of the United States on Mount Rushmore. And for me, that will be Kerrigan. Kerrigan is a leader who's been battle-scarred, brandished, tossed aside, cut from his teams, doubted, come back, dominated, switched teams, came back again, got to the top. He is somebody who perseveres. And in the preservation of Counter-Strike, he embodies the fact that even though he never defended an era and never led the meta over years and dominated, he's been there for each and every instantiation of the metas. He's been relevant throughout the history of the game. He's outlasted Fallen in terms of how long he's been able to stay at the top, how long he's been able to stay at the top. Outshines Glaive, it outshines Pronax, it outshines all of the IGLs of the past that we talk about. And so he preserves the spirit of CS. I think the most wonderful thing I could say about Kerrigan somehow, and this sounds backhanded, but in this last year, FaZe have had a pretty terrible time. 13 months, and all they've won is one tournament. But because it was Pro League, which was also the Grand Slam that took them almost 2 years to end up winning, it shields them a little bit away from criticism, right? Because, oh, they won the Grand Slam. Wait, that's the only thing they won? That's right. Since the last Cologne 2022 in July, the only thing FaZe have won is Pro League, okay? They have 2 top 4 finishes and a top 8 finish. Those are the only accomplishments outside of ESL Pro League Season 17 that FaZe have had since Cologne in 2022. And for some reason, they're not under scrutiny, not in the same way as other teams are. Why is that? This is because even on their worst days, Kerrigan's calling is competent enough that it doesn't feel like the team fell apart in any specific way. When they lose out of a tournament, there is no like mental breakdown that you see that it feels like FaZe suffered that caused them to lose. Emotionally, when we criticize people on cameras for the way that they look and the way that they act, there are things to say sometimes about FaZe players, and Brokey doesn't really reveal his hand. Twist does look a little bit emo sometimes, for example. But in general, if we want to criticize teams for this, and it's actually very easy to criticize teams for this and be totally wrong, I would say FaZe are actually on the lower end of teams that look like they're shaken, look like they're too emo to win, look like they can't come back, and oftentimes prove that even in bad periods, they can make massive comebacks happen. So I think in terms of emotional control, they're actually up there with the best of them. You know, in holding this team together for so long, it does say a lot about the kind of guy he is, because he used to just get cut from his teams, have to try again. But he's had to revitalize his image, but he's done it. And genuinely, I think the frustrating part about me, who wants to be critical of FaZe, is the fact that like I watch them play and maybe it is individuals or something. Maybe that's Kerrigan's fault that he can't bring the best out of his individuals. If they're going to stay together and they're here to play, then we have to hold them to like a winning standard. But at the same time, when you watch them play in terms of the calls and stuff like that, they don't look like an incompetent team. They don't look like they make the wrong moves. They get beaten by better teams because everyone's so good. But I think they get away with it because he's kept this like competent level of calling to make it look like they play detailed enough, that they play aware enough, that they play tier 1 CS all the time, right? And I think that speaks to the preservation of the game, again, because he never led the metas, but he's always been one of the most competitive team in almost every single meta. He's always been there, near the top or at the top. So I'd say he's the Abe, if that makes sense. All right, the 4 presidents. But for a second, I would just like to point out that we should be picturing the 4 presidents wearing ACEZONE hats, okay, with ACEZONE headphones on. They're tired of listening to the tourists coming to South Dakota and talking about them. They would be horrified to find out about things such as TikTok killing our attention spans, creating degenerate behavior from the youths. I don't know. I imagine that's what they would be upset about, considering they're really old. The founding not different. No, important presidents would have had this piece of gear on their heads. Okay, and so should you. If you want audio that's going to impress your dad, buy ACEZONE.